Welcome to the third episode of the EPIC series, UCC Course Approval, Development, and Assessment. In episode 3, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example of a critical thinking assignment that I've done. And this is part 1. I'll talk about what I try to do in the classroom to get them to work through this assignment. And then in part 2, I will go through the questions that they have to answer and how that relates to the critical thinking rubric that the university is going to use. First of all, you've got to give students some access to material that's going to help them get an idea of what the critical thinking question is going to be. A question that does not necessarily have a right or wrong answer. I've used this book, Morality Play, which we ordered last semester. It has several different ethical or critical thinking questions in it, and they're short, so it's not hard for the students to read. They get the idea that there is not a right or wrong answer to a certain issue. So I've used a couple from this book. I've also used some podcasts. If I listen to a podcast and it's got two people talking about an issue that has more than one right or wrong answer, then I play that for them. You can also go on the web and you can find several articles that when the students read the article, they can see that there isn't a right or wrong answer to a certain question. So just as an example, what I've done is I have a form. It's about 11 by 14, and it's still being revised because I've only used it a couple times. What I've done is put a smaller version of that form onto PowerPoint, and I filled everything in that the students would have filled in as we went through the process of learning about critical thinking in class. So I filled everything in early to save some time on the video. So to start with, what I would have them do is read the article, listen to the podcast, and I usually do this in groups the first time, they have to come up with the question. What is the question? What is the dilemma? What is the issue? And in this case, let's say I gave them an article on the legalization of marijuana. The question they should ask is, should the use of marijuana be legal? You just have to make sure the question doesn't have a right or wrong answer. It can have several different viewpoints involved in the answering of that question, or looking at that question, I should say. So that's the first thing I have them do. And then the second thing I have them do is I have them put in the extreme viewpoints. So again, working in a group, they come up with one end of the spectrum answer and the other end of the spectrum answer. So viewpoint 1, all use of marijuana should be illegal. On the other end of the spectrum, all use of marijuana should be legal with no restrictions on the use of marijuana. So again, in the ends here, you have the extreme viewpoints. Up here, there's an area that a book I read on teaching critical thinking called The Shades of Gray. The critical thinking book obviously came out before the books that people are currently reading. So the Shades of Gray, you can use that term. They kind of laughed a little bit when I brought it up the first time. But the whole idea of the Shades of Gray is that there is more viewpoints than just the extremes. One thing I talk to my students about in the political era that they have been raised in, they've pretty much seen that politicians are either on one end or the other. But that for most of these issues, that there are areas and shades of gray that are acceptable answers to our question. So then I have them kind of brainstorm what are middle viewpoints of this issue. So for this, I just came up with that marijuana could be illegal except for medicinal use. Another shade of gray is it's legal. You can smoke marijuana legally with state and federal control. That could include age controls. It could include anything else, that laws that would govern the use of marijuana. So these are kind of middle ground possibilities in terms of their viewpoint. So again, I've had them come up with the question. I've had them come up with the extreme viewpoints. And then I have them come up with the shades of gray. The next thing we do is we go to the back of the sheet and we start listing, or I have them start listing, what are the known facts? What do they know about marijuana, its legality, and so on? And then they also have to list unknown facts. What are things they don't know? What this area allows you to do is it allows you to bring in content into some of these courses. I know doing these critical thinking and ethical thinking, the thought is in some people's, I can't teach content because I won't have time. But this is an area where you can actually bring the content in. So they list what they know, and are those facts correct? So obviously, I had to do a little bit of research on the area. They have to do a little bit of research. But what do they know, and what don't they know, and what would they maybe like to know something about? So what you can do is once they list their known, they need to go check maybe to make sure that those are correct. And then they can start looking for answers to the unknown facts. So they can go look up the addictiveness of marijuana, what changes in the brain occur. And so you can bring in a whole discussion on the brain and how it functions, how the brain changes in the presence of drugs, and so on. So in this case, we're bringing in some biology, but we're also bringing in some legal questions, and you can bring in sociology and those kind of things. So we want them to know, in order to make an educated decision on anything, they have to have the facts. So this again is an area where you can bring in the content area of a course and teach some of that. The other thing they need to look at is stakeholders and the values of those stakeholders. So when they form a viewpoint, they need to understand that it affects more than just them. So they can start listing who the stakeholders are and what the values of those stakeholders are. I have a list of values that will work in any area, but it's a list of values that I found dealing with bioethics. So who does it affect? So I have them again in groups. Who does this issue or this question influence or have an effect on? Who are stakeholders into the answer of that question, or when that question is answered? So patients who smoke for medicinal reasons, they're a stakeholder in the decision that's going to be made. What values? Autonomy, the right to make their own decisions, compassion, if they believe or if it's shown from a factual standpoint that marijuana does decrease pain or helps with cancer, chemo side effects. Compassion, independence, the right of the person to make their own decision. The doctors are also stakeholders. Whether it's legal or illegal or not is going to influence the doctors. Some doctors may believe that smoking marijuana is going to help those patients, so helping others. They also might feel they have a responsibility to offer the patients those marijuana to help them get through the side effects of chemo or with long-term pain. The government officials and law enforcement also are stakeholders in this issue. Personal safety, lawfulness are values that may influence how they feel. Recreational users of marijuana are also stakeholders. Fairness, autonomy are the values that may influence them. So again, what this gets them looking at is how there are other people that are influenced by this issue and how those people are thinking and why they feel the way they do, the values they have that make them think what they do about that issue. So again, we've done the facts, we've looked at stakeholders, we've looked at the values of those stakeholders. After they go through all that, we come back to the front page and we do what's called tugs. What tugs are is it's this tug of war right here. You've got these two viewpoints, extremes, you've got your shades of gray. Right in the middle here is the middle of the tug of war. What they start to do is they go through and they go through the values, they go through the facts, they go through the stakeholders, and they start to put on this tug, this rope, if you want to call it that, how these different values and facts influence their decision. So each person in the class, this area is going to look different because certain values or certain facts may influence them in different ways as compared to other people. For example, if someone believes that all use of marijuana should be legal with no restrictions, and they believe autonomy, the value of autonomy, is what pulls them to that side in a very strong way, then they put autonomy close to the end. If they believe that minimal side effects of taking marijuana influences them towards this side, but not as much as autonomy, then they put it more towards the center. Another thing that may influence, another fact that may influence their decision is the number of people that are in prison. The fact that it costs us millions, who knows how much money, millions of dollars to keep people in prison for smoking marijuana, that leads them towards or pulls them towards the legal side, but maybe it's not a real strong tug. So they put it closer to the center. So what they have on this side is what facts and values and stakeholders are pulling them to this viewpoint and how strong those tugs are. Now they have to have both sides filled out, and this is one of the benefits of this tug. When I first started doing it, I would have students that had all these tugs on one side of the issue and would have nothing here. And so we would start to have the discussion about, if you're a good critical thinker, you have the ability to communicate to other people the other side of the issue. So what tugs them in this direction? Well, why it should be made illegal. It may be they believe personal safety is a strong tug towards this side, so they put it close to this viewpoint. Risk of cancer. In the facts section, the risk of cancer when smoking marijuana may be higher. That would tug them towards this direction, but not as strongly as personal safety. The fact that it does have addictive qualities may pull them towards the illegal side. So they have to have both sides of this rope filled out. Then what I have them do on this form, and again, I have them work in groups, so they're putting plenty of tugs on here. One thing I found, and I need to do this the next time I teach it, is I may have to make a list for them and say, okay, here are all the tugs that you should have on your line, and then you can add anything, because they have a tendency to do just the minimal, maybe only have one or two, where there's actually several facts and values and stakeholders involved in this process, and they should have several tugs on each side. Once they have their tugs, and again, every person's section in here is going to look different depending on their viewpoint, I have them just write out in one sentence their viewpoint. So I believe blah, blah, blah. I try to emphasize with them that it doesn't have to be one or the extreme or the other. It can be, but they actually also need to look at these shades of gray when they're determining their viewpoint. I then have them look at their context, and this is an area that I found that they have a hard time with. The contexts are, what about them? What about their experiences, their political beliefs, religious beliefs, scientific background? What is making them think the way they think? So I believe this, and this is what influences my decision. It may be their age. It may be their past experiences with the drug, with marijuana. It may be that they had a relative with cancer or that was in chronic pain that marijuana may have helped. Their political beliefs may be the context in which they're influencing their thinking. They also have to look at their values. What are their values? What are their values? And how do those values influence their viewpoint on this issue? So autonomy may be a value that's very strong to them that influences their decision. Independence is another value that may be a very strong value for them that pulls them in one direction or the next. So this gives them, by the time they have this whole thing filled out, they should be able to answer the questions that I would put on the assignment. So again, I have them fill this out. The first time I have them do it, I have them do it as a group, so they can talk to each other, get information from other people, and I do have them hand this in when they hand in their critical thinking assignment. So this is the end of part 1. And in the second part of this section, I will go through the assignment they have to complete based on the information they have written on this form.